A warning. This episode contains graphic descriptions of crime scenes and violent crime. Please listen with care.
A LiSTNR production.
In the winter of 1988, two gold prospectors were scouring the picturesque area of Mount Firebrace in Victoria when their search unearthed something far more chilling than treasure. Inside a disused mineshaft, they found a decomposed, mummified, headless body. For local police and Melbourne's elite homicide squad, it was a mystery frozen in time. Could forensics bring the truth to light? That's what today's guest, forensic pathologist Professor David Ranson, set out to uncover. My name's Liz Porter. I'm a journalist, true crime author, and forensic science obsessive. I've spent my career uncovering how forensic science cracks the toughest cases, writing 3 books on the subject and earning a PhD in the history of the Victoria Police Forensic Science Lab. Join me as I sit down with the world's top forensic experts and discover how forensic science is convicting the guilty and exonerating the innocent.
Decomposed bodies are, obviously something we have part of the work that we do all over the world. But of course, anywhere where you could have a body in isolation for a period of time or hidden away increases the chances of that. And again, where there are high temperatures, we increase that opportunity for decomposition. So I probably saw more decomposed cases when I came to Australia than I had seen when I was in the United Kingdom, although we certainly did see our share of decomposed cases. But I don't think I'd ever seen a headless body brought to me. And the key thing here was that I hadn't been to the scene, but there was a body at the scene down this mine shaft. There was no head, and I'm sure they'd had a good look. That is certainly very unusual. Clearly, when you're faced with that, you've got sort of 3 or 4 things you need to do. Firstly, you've got to try to work out who is this person. That's a very important issue. Secondly, you've got to try and find out, well, how did they die? And when you've got a situation like this, sort of the headless body, well, then one of the questions that often arise, of course, is them losing their head part of their cause of death? Or is this something that's happened post-mortem? Things are much, much more difficult when they're decomposed because your opportunity to see the skin surface and to look for characteristics and wounding patterns on the skin surface is very much reduced. Secondly, everything is changed in colour, so looking for things like bruising and abrasions becomes incredibly difficult and may in fact be impossible in advanced decomposition. And you've got this sort of puzzle to solve, and you're handicapped by those natural decompositional processes. Strangely enough, however, when it comes to working out how the head came off, the decomposition actually helps a little bit because the soft tissues have gone from those areas and you're actually able to look at the bone more critically, and there was fragmentation there that indicated some force had been applied. And the pattern of that was much more likely to have occurred post-mortem than ante-mortem.
There was something about the decomposition pattern that gave you a bit of an idea about what had happened to the body.
Yeah, because one of the striking things about this case was there was obviously advanced decomposition. In fact, large areas of skin from the trunk and an abdomen and so on were missing. But the body was then mummified. In other words, it had dried out. Now, that's a different process, and you can get mummification of a fresh body over a period of time, and there's often very little decomposition. But here we had advanced decomposition and then mummification on top of that. Well, that tells you something. It tells you that the body's been somewhere and enabled it to decompose. It's then been somewhere else where there is cool airflow that allows the body to dry out. And those 2 features are relatively unusual. You don't see that very often. You can see mummification, person found dead in a house and with heaters on and things dry out and so on. But this was an advanced decomposition which had been stopped effectively by the mummification, drying the tissues out. So that made me view this person as being dead somewhere in one place for a while and then had moved to another place for a while. When you get these really mummified changes and decomposition changes, the body looks basically black. What did occur to me was there were some funny marks on the arms. So we actually took the arms and we did specialized light studies where we used infrared and ultraviolet lighting of them to see what would be revealed in these blackened limbs, basically. And sure enough, when we used infrared, we could see complex tattoo patterns, including tattoo patterns that had letters and numbers and things like that in it, and statements and so on. And interestingly, there is a very good database, or there was a very good database of all individuals' tattoos and things like that, particularly if they've been in custody. These were recorded, and there was actually a bit of a match. So we were able to get an idea who this person might be. We still didn't have any teeth. We didn't have their head or anything like that. I do have to say, of course, that we did have some personal property on the person, which gave us a bit of a running clue here. But even with personal property, you've got to be very careful, because people don't always have their own wallet, if you know what I mean. So you've got to individually forensically identify the body and do it in such a way that if a head is subsequently found, we can link all that up effectively. So we did this tattoo analysis and so on, and it did turn out that a little while later, a head was delivered to me in a plastic bag, which had actually come from, I think, a wombat burrow or something like that. And when we looked at it, one of the things we wanted to do, obviously we did all the identification of things. Again, it was decomposed, and with some mummification changes as well. We did dental type work on it, of course, for ID. And we also carefully looked at the remaining vertebra on the bottom of the skull to match those with the vertebra in the body of the headless body. And we could actually match the vertebra together and look at the damage pattern so that there was the same sort of damage on the same side. So we could link them, at least in that mechanistic way. And then later on, obviously, the other identification processes could be done.
And there was a later dental identification, which showed something that, however, sadly, the police were pretty sure about, because in the pocket of the jeans that the body had been wearing was...
Yep, some identification material.
His doll form.
Yes, that's right. So we had the identification material. Again, you've got to be super careful, because there was one very famous mass disaster situation where one person had something like 25 passports on them, because they were the courier for the tour or whatever the people killed. And so people didn't have their own personal documents because they'd all been handed over to the courier. So you've got to be very careful, because people do steal things. There was a very famous industrial fire in the UK where they solved the problem of the pilfering from the changing rooms, because, again, one of the deceased had wallets from other people on them. So you've got to be very careful with, which is why once you've got that ID, the potential ID from the document, you then have to corroborate it, this time not only with the head, but also with the body itself.
So this case shows that while the forensic work was intricate and fascinating, it didn't actually solve the crime, and I know you are very attached to this case, but it's one of the cases you have never been able to recommend to any drama writer that they use in their investigation.
Well, that's right, because most people like to think that people killing people are clever. And this case was about concealing the identity of this individual, and they had gone to great lengths to conceal the identity of this individual by removing the head and things like that. But when they left identification in the jeans pockets, it's probably a better reflection of the real level of forensic expertise of many people who get involved in doing away with others.
And it also reflects the fact that in the real world, the forensic work no matter how detailed and excellent, doesn't always solve the crime.
No, that's right. I think it's important to remember that we're mostly, as I said, corroborative. Witness A says this, witness B says this. Well, Doc, what do you think? Which one's telling the truth? And it's much more in that space. The accused person says, well, it happened like this. And the forensic pathologist goes, no, I don't think it did. And it didn't for these reasons. And maybe the path, the projectile or whatever. I remember a case I had where the issue was whether this person was turning or turned and pointing a gun at somebody when they were shot. And I explored the path of the bullet through this person's body, and it formed a spiral. Well, bullets don't go in a spiral through a target. They go in a straight line. But if you twist the body, it goes through a twisted body. So when you untwist the body and you examine on the mortuary table, the path through the body is a spiral. So I was able to corroborate what somebody said, that this person had spun around and pointed a weapon, and then they were shot. So again, it's often these things where you're reconstructing the circumstances far more than a cause of death. I mean, somebody gets shot, they get shot, and it goes through a vital area of the body, and you say, cause of death, gunshot wound to X. Easy. That's not the majority of the challenge we're faced with. It's, well, how did that come to happen?
So, David, could you take us back to 1990 and an investigation that you worked on which involved a man who was found lying outside a Melbourne pub?
We had an interesting case of a person found collapsed outside a pub. And the initial investigation was suggesting that he'd been drunk and had fallen over. I say investigation, it was really basically the police arriving, I think, and just seeing what the situation, asking a few people, and said, oh, yes, he was drunk and he wandered out and then he's found on the pavement, collapsed and so on.
And he's dead.
And he's dead. And I can't remember now whether there was some marking on his neck or head or whatever at this stage, but certainly there were some marks. And we did an autopsy, and this was actually conducted by one of the trainees at the time, a very, very good pathologist. We uncovered a subarachnoid hemorrhage. Now, this is a hemorrhage around the brain. It's on the surface of the brain, and its usual cause is that one or more of the arteries that form a little network at the base of the brain, all feeding into each other, may get an aneurysm on it, or a little blowout on the artery, and if it ruptures, it forms hemorrhage in the subarachnoid region. And it can spread over the surface of the brain, both the top and the sides underneath. But this was, substantive hemorrhage and towards the base of the brain. And the sort of assumption you have is, well, it's probably got to have one of these berry aneurysms, little blowouts on the artery. But there wasn't one. And that was the point. There wasn't one. And we carefully dissected and identified that actually there was seen to be damage to one of the vertebral arteries that run up on either side of the cervical spine. Now, that's a very unusual change to have that coming from an artery, this vertebral artery. And it suggests trauma, significant trauma. This is not minor or trivial that you get by tripping over and banging your head or something like that. There's something more to it. And we know that these vessels can get damaged when they get stretched in particular ways. And one of the ways is if their head is turned in some particular way and then there is more additional force applied beyond what you would normally do to turn your head, which, if you like, then gives it a sort of stretch snap. I mean, I'm simplifying what is in fact quite a complicated potential set of mechanisms. But it's not well understood. And the problem about it to some extent is that whilst we know about berry aneurysms and the neurosurgeons deal with people who have spontaneous bleeding and stuff like that, most of these people get vertebral artery injuries, pretty much drop dead at the time the injury happens. So they don't get to hospital. They don't get to see the neurosurgeons. They never get into that therapeutic environment. And the knowledge base about this injury tends to stay in the forensic medicine environment rather than the neurosurgical environment. And there have been a few cases around the world where neurosurgeons have said, no, you must have missed the aneurysm. That you have to have a aneurysm to get this sort of hemorrhage. And forensic pathologists are saying, well, no, it appears to be coming from a vertebral artery. And neurosurgeons say, well, we've never seen this. And well, no, you haven't, because they dropped dead. So it was an interesting sort of area where the medical profession itself, with its own little window on what's going on, had come to different conclusions. So what we had here was somebody outside a pub with this very specific type of subarachnoid hemorrhage, which told us that there had been some significant trauma. We told the police that, and they said, well, we just don't have any evidence of this sort of trauma. So the most likely explanation is he must have fallen over. And I said, well, that's not how this happens. But they didn't have any further investigative issues. And I think in those days there wasn't CCTV coverage all over the place in the way that we would have today. And it wasn't until a little while later when a couple of people walked into a police station and simply gave themselves up and said, actually, we attacked this guy and I think they hit him with a beer barrel or something like this.
So, David, what are your interactions with the police in an investigation like this usually like?
It's interesting when you think about forensic pathology. A lot of times people are thinking about, homicides and suspicious things, and people get confronted by what they see at scenes of death, and they worry that this is a homicide. And so what we're often able to do as a forensic pathologist is to reassure the police that what they're seeing is not necessarily the result of a criminal act, but maybe the result of a natural disease process. So where we were talking about the issues with subarachnoid hemorrhage, here's a situation where we've got trauma leading to this particular feature of hemorrhage, subarachnoid hemorrhage around the brain. Now, the most common scenarios in which that occurs might be a motor vehicle accident, but often where there's no trauma involved, it's because there's a rupture of an aneurysm on the vessels around the base of the brain. And that causes death, and there may be a bit of confusion and disturbance in the scene, but essentially it's a natural disease, death caused by this hemorrhage. Now, there's a lot of other things you can look at in a scene which may give you an idea that, in fact, whilst this looks peculiar and may look pretty horrific, in fact, it may not be the result of trauma, but maybe the result of natural disease. Let me give some examples of how that can occur. So firstly, you've got situations where somebody has a disease process in their body that can cause them to lose a lot of blood externally. Now, typical areas and that occurs are bleeding into the lungs and the airways and bleeding into the stomach or bowel, where they can obviously vomit blood or cough blood up. Now, you get somebody who's, say, got a lung cancer, which then erodes into a major pulmonary artery or major pulmonary vessel. They can actually lose a vast amount of blood into their airway and cough and splutter it. I have seen a situation where a person's been lying on the floor outside against a brick wall with blood spattered up the wall for sort of 10 feet in all directions, purely because of a lung tumour having eroded into an artery. Now, often these are people who haven't received a lot of care and attention, medical attention. They're people who are isolated from medical care. They may be, down and out, sleeping rough, those sorts of individuals who are very, very vulnerable to, serious disease which goes untreated. Another example might be a situation where someone has a long history of abusing alcohol, for example. They develop cirrhosis, and one of the problems of developing cirrhosis is they can develop essentially varicose veins in their esophagus or gullet. And if they then have an episode of vomiting, perhaps associated with alcohol use, they can tear those veins and can have torrential hemorrhage. I remember a case from overseas now where I went into a house. Police were very concerned. Body is leaning into the bath upstairs. There's handprints in blood on the wall. There's gel blood in the bath. There's smears of blood all over the place. There's blood all over this person's face and hands and so on. But as you walk around that scene of death, which looked pretty traumatic and it looked really very nasty, you started to pick up the background of this person's life. You open the fridge and there's lots of cans of alcohol, but there's no food. And you look behind the sofa and you look in the waste bins and they're just empty bottles of alcohol everywhere. You look around then for where are the hospital appointment slips, where are the prescriptions, where are the letters from the doctors, where are the, and you start to try and build up a picture of this person's medical background. And as it develops that there is evidence they've got severe cirrhosis, all of a sudden those features that are so dramatic and quite horrific really start actually falling into place as being something that is not unexpected in the context of their disease. And someone who's actively bleeding like this may well get confused, they're losing blood, they feel faint, they're trying to support themselves, they're putting their hands on the walls as they're trying to make their way to the bar. You're just reconstructing the events of this person's final moments based on your understanding of the medicine and your understanding of what the scene is showing you. And then when you come to look at that person, you start going over the outside of their body, you find there's no breach in the skin. They've got no other bleeding point. So you can sort of put those things together in that way and explain things. There are some other really peculiar ones where I've gone to a scene and police have been very worried about some injuries on the body, and I've just looked and seen the trail of ants. And the fact that these injuries looked dramatic was that the ants have just got onto the body and they just nibble away the surface layers of skin. They don't breach the skin, but those areas then dry out and they look dark brown and look like nasty grazes, abrasions and bruising and so on. They're not that at all. They're just a post-mortem change caused by insects.
Or if you went to a house and you found usually an elderly person lying half naked under their bed.
Yeah.
And the first police officer on the scene might think this is a murder, possibly with a sexual overtone.
Yes. Yeah, this is not an uncommon sort of scenario, particularly in winter and cold weather. We get this condition of what's called paradoxical undressing. So people can often take their clothes off because they are getting a feeling of warmth, but it's actually because they're actually becoming hypothermic. So their temperature's going down, they get confused, they actually start to get a sort of reverse feeling of warmth, they take clothing off, and they often crawl into spaces. So they'll crawl behind the side of a wardrobe or sort of under some staircase or crawling away. And they often have quite changes on their elbows and knees and so discolorations, and this fits a particular pattern where you get hypothermia with these changes, and certainly seen that a number of times, and indeed sometimes you'll see particular changes when you do an autopsy in the stomach that indicates they've got these multiple small hemorrhages in the mucosa of the stomach, Wyszynski spots, and they fit this same sort of pattern of what's going on. I've even had cases involving situations where people have been found outside in the same situation. They've serially taken their clothes off. And of course, the thought that this might be some sort of sexual attack is something that's deeply concerning to investigators. And obviously, you need to properly check that hasn't happened. But again, it's another example of aspects of human behaviour and human physiology that needs to be better understood so that we can actually correctly identify these cases early on and sort them out as quickly as possible.
So if the police can be confused by what they're seeing at a crime scene, anyone can. What do you think is the aspect of forensics that's most misunderstood by the public?
Well, I think that's one of them. And the other one I think is the problem of people being multi-skilled. So a lot of these shows have one forensic scientist who does every branch of forensic science. I mean, I tend to look at this in terms of what I call condensations. So we have sort of three primary condensations which TV shows are forced often into actually having to do. And the first of those is the number of characters. So what's done in the real world by 20, 30 people is done by one person in the TV show. in terms of the forensics. I mean, ballistics people don't do chemistry analysis. Chemistry analysis people don't do other aspects of firearms or DNA. The DNA people don't do botany and fungi as spores and that sort of thing. They're all separate disciplines, and they're applying their particular scientific skill to the problem that they've been presented with. And so the reality in a TV show, of course, is you can't have that number of characters. I mean, most audiences hold 4 or 5 characters perhaps in their minds. You know, if you suddenly presented them with 50 characters, all doing different sciences, it would just be a nightmare. You couldn't shoot it probably as an episode. But it's so that's one condensation. The next one is condensation of time. And that is, you know, results have to come back within the space of a 40-minute show, ad breaks, whatever. And indeed, actually, people structure ad breaks in a show in order to let an amorphous period of time pass before the results come back after the ad break. Now, the reality is that, you know, some test results may take a week or two, some may take a month or two to come back. So you can't have that in a TV show. Most of the storylines are tighter than that. You can't bring that sort of space of time in that. And the third condensation, of course, is geography. It all happens in one place. There's the mortuary table, there's the analytical equipment of the lab on the far bench over there, or perhaps in the next room. Whereas the reality is, you know, mortuaries are quite challenging places to be in. Your big OH&S issues have got to be managed in them. You don't want anything else going on in that mortuary or even near it, which relates to any other aspect of forensic science and so on. And the geography, that means that you need to control who's going to those spaces. So you go in from one lab to another lab, there'll be a key card access, everybody's movements are recorded in the central security database. None of that is part of the show.
And you know very well about the differences between real life and television because you have consulted for many years on many different television shows. Can you tell us a few of those?
Oh, yes. I mean, it goes back to sort of got involved with it, I think, in some of the probably the later days of Blue Healers years and years ago. But a number of other shows, City Homicide I was involved with. There's the show State Coroner that Channel 10 did, which we're involved with again. And in some of them, I just helped with sort of scripts and storyline. Others, like State Coroner, I went on set quite a lot, helping the actors in terms of, well, what do you do when you're doing an autopsy? Physically, how do you stand and holding instruments and all that sort of thing? So there's an element of that. Helping with the arts department, you know, create something that looks reasonably like a human brain so they can get a quick, you know, shot of this being carried in a tray somewhere else. And we don't use human brains or anything like that, of course. But there's ways in which you can help with that. You know, does this blood stain look correct at a scene? You know, what does it look like when someone's been lying there bleeding? You know, how do we want to make that look? There are some challenges. And one of the challenges, of course, is people always want to find out good, hidden, difficult to solve ways of killing people. And, you know, it would be lovely. I can think of plenty of them, I can tell you now, but I'm not sure I want the broader community to know how, you know, what sort of sneaky thing you could use to kill someone and not easily be found out. I'm not sure that's in the public interest. So I have to sort of balance a little bit of that. That's not to say that I'm not going to help them, but we do it in such a way as to not make it easy or obvious for anyone else to go along those paths. And I have to say that the good writers and producers are really on top of that. They certainly don't want anything like that to come out of it.
So in your view, why is it so important that fictional stories on television be scientifically accurate?
Well, I think there's a great sense in which, you know, producers and directors do want things to be right. They want their story to gel with their whole audience. Now, true, 80%, 90% of their audience probably wouldn't know whether some little thing was done incorrectly. But there might be that, you know, 5%, ex-police, ex-whatever, who might well find, well, that's a bit odd. Does that matter? Well, it depends on the style of show. If your show is somewhat sort of what I call glib and sci-fi like, then it probably doesn't matter terribly. But if you're trying to go for that sort of gritty realism, then I think it does distract from the storyline. But there's another sort of hidden sort of element of this. And the hidden element is that, you know, in our society, when we're dealing with crimes and we have trials, we have a jury that for the most part in serious offences is hearing this evidence. What I don't want there to be is a disconnect between what that jury has learned from the TV fiction shows and what they are being told by the expert in the courtroom. Because if there's a big disconnect between those two things, it throws the real evidence potentially into doubt in that jury member's mind. Now, that's where the social danger lies.
So is there any show on television that you would actually recommend as being accurate?
I'm not in the business of recommending shows, unless, of course, I've been the one to do the advice on them. But no. I think most shows these days do try to get it right, and I don't think it's too hard to spot the shows that don't have that emphasis in the work that they're putting into the preparation and planning of the show. I do see little things that niggle me every now and then. So, for example, you know, people pulling a bullet out of the wall or something with some metal forceps, which would scratch the bullet dreadfully and make forensic examination much harder to do. Whereas in fact, you would always use, you know, soft implements, nylon, or actually cut out the area where the hole is and get the bullet out really carefully and so on, so you don't damage it. So there's things like that which are not done.
Or a forensic scientist actually leaving the lab and doing some investigation on their own.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly right. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I certainly do not want to be going out into dangerous spaces with people with lots of guns around. Why should I? I'm perfectly happy dealing with a dead body and looking after them and making sure that we learn from them. I have been at scenes where I've been certainly in a slightly vulnerable situation, certainly in some of my overseas deployment stuff. You know, I've been in locations where I've been doing work where I've heard gunshots every night in a dangerous environment. Certainly do remember rolling up at a scene in Melbourne to find almost nobody at the scene when I arrived except a scene guard, someone standing there with a clipboard, and I got out of my car and spoke to this person. He said, they've all gone off to some other little scene nearby. He said, I think you should get back into your car and lock the doors because we think the suspect could be in the car behind you. So I got back in my car and I locked the doors. I wonder whether I should have driven off and gone around the block a few times. But, you know, it doesn't happen. I mean, we are not usually in a threatening situation, and it is the job of the principal investigators from the police in all of those things to make sure the entire team is safe, and they do a really good job of that.
Okay, thank you so much, David. As always, it's been so interesting.
Well, thank you, Liz.
Crime Insiders Forensics is hosted by me, Liz Porter. It's produced by Holly Mitchell, Dan Mullins and Jade Murray. Sound design is by Link Kelly.